as follows. One, I'm going to briefly introduce the participants of the roundtable. Then I'm going to give each participant a little bit of time to offer a gloss of her or his project. Then I'm going to pose some questions, broadly conceived and/or project specific, to all the participants, and then they can choose to engage or not with those questions. And then we're going to invite audience members, all of you, to offer responses, additional questions, engagements with the participants' projects and presentations. Crucially, while my moderating efforts will be primarily in English, all of you are invited to linguistically democratize the discussion. So I'll start with introductions. Karen works on 20th century visual art and critical social and psychoanalytic theory. Her research addresses the relationship between art and ideology and political collectivity and capitalism in the global periphery. Karen is the author of one of the subjects of our conversation today, Dematerialization, Art and Design in Latin America, published this year by the University of California Press. She's also recently finished editing Accumulation and Subjectivity in Latin America, a collection of scholarly essays addressing debates about the historical logic of capitalism and social theory and contemporary studies of law, urban planning, film, and theater. She's working on 2 book-length studies, one exploring theories of psychic, political, and natural life in relation to capitalist expansion in Latin America, and another examining art and hegemony in the short 20th century in Chile. An editor and contributor to the journal Art Margins since 2012, Karen will be a visiting scholar in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at NYU in the coming academic year. If it's not obvious, I'm reading from bios that they shared with me and that I solicited. Gustavo is an assistant professor of Romance Studies at Duke University. As of July 1st, he will be promoted to the rank of associate professor and receive a secondary appointment in Duke's Department of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies. His research and teaching interests include film and media theory, Latin American literature and cinema, travel narratives and writing and film, documentary studies, and ethnographic and indigenous filmmaking. His articles have appeared in several venues. I actually am not going to name them all. There's several. His monograph, Documentary Filmmaking in Contemporary Brazil, Cinematic Archives of the Present, won the 2020 Antonio Candido Prize for Best Book in the Humanities, awarded by the Brazil section of LASA. This book is going to be one of our subjects of discussion for today. Gustavo is currently working on several projects, including a manuscript provisionally titled Mapping the Amazonian Moving Image, Media, Territoriality, and the Census in the Amazon. Okay, let's see. I'm trying to go in alphabetical order here. Erin is professor of Spanish and Portuguese and Comparative Literature and chair of the Department of Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. She's the author of 3 books, Anarchaeologies, Reading as Misreading, which we're going to talk about today, Figurative Inquisitions, Conversion, Torture, and Truth in the Luso-Hispanic Atlantic, winner of the 2015 award for Best Book, Latin American Jewish Studies Association, and the Wandering Signifier, Rhetoric of Jewishness in the Latin American Imaginary. She's currently working on a new book project, Transmedial Exposure, which evaluates the aesthetic, ethical, and political consequences of the exposure of one medium to another. Okay, now I'm going to look at, for Héctor's bio, I'm taking it from the website of Stanford. He's an associate professor of Latin American literature and culture at Stanford. He holds a PhD in Romance Studies from Cornell. His book, Beyond Bolaño, the Global Latin American Novel, is the first monographic theoretical study of Latin American novelistic representations of globalization of its kind. And then his latest book that we're going to talk about today is Things with a History, Transcultural Materialism and the Literatures of Extraction in Contemporary Latin America. It develops the concept of transculturation as a way of integrating new and historical strands of materialism in the study of narrative. Freya is an associate professor in the Media Cultural Studies Department and a cooperating faculty member in the Hispanic Studies Department at the University of California, Riverside. Her research and teaching straddled the fields of Latin American cultural and film studies and the interdisciplinary field of Indigenous media studies. She is the author of Indianizing Film, Decolonization, the Andes and the Question of Technology, and of the book that we're going to discuss today, The Open Invitation, Activist Video, Mexico and the Politics of AFACT. She serves on the editorial board of the Journal for Latin American Cultural Studies and has co-edited several books, most recently together with Bright Wamak Weber, Adjusting the Lens, Community and Collaborative Video in Mexico. Her articles and book chapters have been published in English, Spanish, and German. Her current research focuses on how collaborative and indigenous video art and activism conceptualize and make apprehensible the relationship of the human and the non-human, issues of dispossession, ruined lands, racism, gender, green conservatism, and what it means to live well. And of the latter, I hope that will also be something that we'll have time to discuss today. Okay, so now we're going to go in order. Each is going to summarize the books that I signaled that we're going to talk about today. Offer a brief summary. So Karen, you can start.
Okay, let me be the first to thank everybody for coming and for publicizing the event, and especially to Amy for taking on the work of reading all these books and formulating these questions. So I'll try to do this succinctly so that we have enough time for everyone. So dematerialization looks at works and theories of conceptually and semiotically driven art and industrial design in Mexico, Chile, and Argentina in the 1960s and 70s. Many of the figures that I focus on may be more and less familiar to readers depending on the fields they work in, but also because of the sort of the ways that the work of people like Oscar Mazota or Octavio Paz or Alberto Ijar or Tomás Maldonado were, in a sense, kind of extraordinarily multifaceted and tended to form part, even different parts of their own kind of corpuses tended to form part of radically different conversations at the time. But what they share in common and what I try to sort of elaborate upon is, apart from certain regional and historic determinations, right, being Latin American in the 1960s and 70s, is the way they approached a certain kind of sea change in the language and social relevance of art and industrial design, whether we think of this in terms of the caducity of the opposition between modernism and muralism in the Mexican context, or the encroachment of the market on the possibilities of the avant-garde for Oscar Mazota, or the commercialization and transformation of the commercialization of the kind of transformative spiritual potential of form in architecture and industrial design in the same era. And so what's kind of special about them is that more than kind of, or rather than sort of mourning or denouncing the effects of the market or the irrelevance of modernism or of state-sponsored muralism, all of these authors looked at the social and formal transformations of the era as the occasion for redefining art and design and their social function. And so I was interested in emphasizing the extent to which this thinking was about the crisis of the art and design object, the way that it ran in parallel to and was in many ways richer and more complex than what we tend to think of as the kind of heights of self-reflexivity in conceptual art, or kind of synonymous with that US conceptual art in the same period. And this kind of brings me to the book's basic proposal or provocation, which is that dematerialization functions not only as a descriptive term in reference to the art or design object, but also as a heuristic tool, right? A concept that allows us to see something. And that something, as I try to argue, is the structuration of society and the role that ideology plays in it. So let me then maybe make a few remarks about my choice of the word dematerialization as a word and as a framework, and sort of about the critical stakes of the book as a whole. I think anyone interested in the history or familiar with the history of art since the 1960s recognizes dematerialization as a kind of ubiquitous term, perhaps most closely associated with the work of the critical and curatorial work of Lucy Lepard, and a word that's used to describe the turn away from the materials and conventions of modernism towards the embrace of language and systems aesthetics that we tend to associate with conceptualism, more broadly speaking. And yet, setting aside the foundational texts of dematerialization, which I try to locate both in Lepard and in Massota's use of the term, which are both kind of fascinating studies in sort of intertextuality, right, and parallel readings. And this is where the book begins. But setting those aside, we tend, when we think of the connotations of the word in the critical literature, really since the codification of conceptualism in the 1990s, looking backwards, I was interested in the way that the art critical discourse often kind of asks the term dematerialization to bear so many different meanings, right? A much weightier set of theses about the historical determination of the crisis of art and design, right? Something happened in capitalism and therefore something happened to art. Or inversely, the way that this turn towards systems aesthetics or language was somehow best suited to express the kind of expansion of capitalism or the expansion or generalization of the commodity form of labor in the third world, thinking of, say, like Jameson's thesis in postmodernism. And so rather than assuming this connection between capitalism and art, right, I began, and conceptual art or immaterial art, I began by asking the texts and artworks themselves sort of how they understood the relationship between the crisis of the art and design object and the crisis of socio-political organization in the 1960s. And the answer to that question sort of seeks to address two different discussions, the answer being the book itself, which were sort of ever present but rarely in conversation with one another as I was researching and thinking about how to go about writing the book. The first of those discussions bears on the potential and shortcomings, bears on a specific discussion, sort of specific to kind of structuralism or Marxist structuralism in the work of Louis Althusser. And it bears on the way that Althusser tried to define the epistemological function of art, or just define art in its epistemological function, which is to say that for Althusser, art allowed us to perceive or feel ideology in a way that science or Marxist theory didn't, right? And yet, though visual art was perhaps less important for Althusser than theater, I think the critic Michael Sprinker is correct in pointing to a more basic assumption in Althusser's remarks on art, which is that Althusser saw art and science both as sort of working upon or transforming the raw metaphorical material of ideology, right? And sort of giving form to this, to the kind of metaphorical stuff of ideology or of the kind of reified appearance of social relations. And as a kind of correlate to that, who saw the necessity of a kind of general theory of art or of a philosophy of art to, in a sense, formalize or name or allow us to understand how this was happening. In other words, art couldn't do this itself, but needed a kind of aesthetics or philosophy to come along and name what it was doing. And so in contrast to this, or thinking about this, part of what I try to underscore in the book is the extent to which a certain form of this reflexivity was embedded in the artworks and in relation to the specificity of their social and political conjunctures. In other words, the idea is sort of, as you might note, kind of looking at how the chapters are constructed, is that art and politics think, and they think in this case, not by forming the raw material of social appearances, but by allowing us to see through their dematerialization the way that those appearances structure social relations. And so this brings me to the second discussion that I hope to address, and this will be my last point, which is that the principal target of this whole thing for a long time was, and I think continues to be, a certain kind of set of prevailing assumptions in cultural and art histories of the neo-avant-gardes in the 1960s and 70s that tended to see the crisis in visual representation as somehow organically linked to the crisis of political representation. And now any good Latin Americanist knows that the crisis of political representation is constitutive with the constitution of the nation state, right? But the view that the implication of art and politics in the 60s and 70s, right, or of anti-formalist art and radical politics that they're necessarily intertwined, is really pernicious, right, for a couple of different reasons, right? It's pernicious because in a kind of more circumscribed sense, it's tended to dictate the way, the kind of cultural particularism that tends to code the way that Latin American anti-formalism or experimentalism of this period is inscribed within sort of the global discourse of art or discourse about so-called global art of the 60s and 70s or global conceptualism. But this is, I think, a part of a larger issue, right, which has to do with the way that the assumption that sort of art, that this has tended to define, right, this assumption has tended to define the entire field of what is possible in art and cultural criticism, sort of under the prevailing assumption that history is over and all we can do now is document it, right? In other words, that art experimentation came to its end together with class struggle or the possibilities of new forms of society. And so if there's something that I hope perhaps we can talk about or that readers take away from the book is that in returning to the 1960s, and in particular to this kind of perhaps somewhat marginal scene of criticism, its interest in articulating theories with institutions and broad socio-political conditions is meant to signal the possibility of a kind of new beginning, right? A kind of recommencement that we can take from the authors themselves about the relationship between art and ideology or art and society for doing work, but also for the present today. So with that, I'll conclude.
Am I next?
Gustavo.
Anyone
Yes.
following Karen will seem inarticulate, so this is really unfair. So my book is about documentary filmmaking in Brazil in a period that begins in 1985 at the end of the dictatorship and beginning of democratization of Brazilian society. And it's a period that, as you all know from news that are coming in every day, right? A very vibrant and turbulent period with significant efforts at democratizing Brazil, at changing Brazilian society, but also significant failures in that process. What I think has been less appreciated is how vital, diverse, rich, inventive the field of documentary filmmaking was during that period as well. And that's what my book initially wanted to address, right? There's basically like this really, at a first glance, amazingly diverse body of documentary production of every sort, from polished art house films to very experimental activist projects, to performance pieces, etc., that emerge in this period, and that I believed from the start that were connected in some important ways. What my book does is ask, how does the documentary form respond, reflects, and participate in these transformations in this period? And it explores that by thinking about the archive, the concept of the archive, in part because the documentary and the archive have never been fully theorized. The concept of the archive comes up in documentary theory, but often in a somewhat marginal, not fully thought out way, often as a descriptive term. But it's actually fundamental for the documentary as a practice. Even when films oppose ideas of the archive, they are in some sense negotiating some relation with the concept of the archive. So the book kind of asks, what is this relation of documentary and archive to begin with, and how does that play out in Brazil in particular, in a moment when you have changes in technology, changes in forms of financing the film, changing in communities of viewership, changing cultures of the visual image. So how does this play out? So the archive, that in the ways that I explore, come up in very literal senses. I deal with contexts. The book has three parts, and the contexts are very broad, but fundamentally tied in the book. The first context is ethnographic. So I look at anthropological films, ethnographic films, and then indigenous media that emerged in the 1980s onwards. So this first part of the book kind of deals with the margins of the national in a sense. And the very idea of the nation is some very emblematic level, the sort of the contact scene being the most mythic, iconic image that comes to mind. Context. The second part of the book thinks about law, visibility, and marginalization. And so it thinks about the cities mainly. And the third part reflects on private and intimate life and how that domain has merged with the public sphere, how images of home life have become more public, but also the specific politicized ways in which filmmakers have explored that in the past 30 years in Brazil. I began writing this book in a much more optimistic moment for Brazilian society. I began writing about 2012 or thereabouts. I finished the first draft in 2016. So it was a very interesting book about the contemporary in a sense, because the contemporary was changing very rapidly before my eyes. When I finished the first draft of the book was shortly before Dilma Rousseff was impeached. So the book is sort of has a couple of different layers that are written upon it as this is happening, because as I was revising the book in 2017 and finished the final draft in early 2018, it had become absolutely clear that the coup had been successful and what the new shape of Brazilian scenario was going to be. So it's also a book that speculates a little bit about what is the possible futures of filmmaking, political filmmaking, documentary practice, and all of the questions that it asks along the way. What is its new future at this moment of doom that had become fully visible just as the book was going to the press. So in a sense, it's a book about the contemporary that's already passed. It's a book about the last period of Brazilian democracy, in a sense. And I think that period has closed. I think I'll finish here.
I think I'm next. Thank you, Karen, for organizing this. Once we realized that we weren't going to be together at LASA, Karen asked us whether we'd like to do something online. And at the time, I think we weren't yet Zoomed out. I think we had just begun this new adventure. At this point, like I'm not super excited about extra Zoom meetings in life, but this one is an exception. It is really, really wonderful to see all of your faces. So thank you to Karen, especially. Thank you to Amy for agreeing to moderate and for reading our books. I'm going to try to be brief. You know, every time that I have kind of gotten to the end of one project and begun another project, and I don't know if this has happened to you, I've realized, oh my gosh, what I really wanted to be working on was this. Or you kind of get to the end and realize, like, this is my big question, or this is the big thing that's missing from my project. So when I got to the end of Figurative Inquisitions, in which I was thinking about the different ways in which we engage with and pursue truth, I realized that what I really wanted to ask was, well, so what does this mean for what we do in literary studies, but also in ethical and political philosophy? So that was the question that was guiding this project, which is to say that if we don't have a direct relation to truth, if our relation to truth is not non-existent, but rather is mediated, and my particular approach to mediation is through motifs of misunderstanding, blindness, error, opacity. So if our ways of reading must be attentive to errors and to blindness and to misunderstanding, what does that mean for literary studies in the first place, right? Where reading is at the center of what we do. I would argue for a return to reading, but not in kind of the classical humanist sense, but rather in a deconstructive sense, which I can talk about. And then also, how do we approach or return to ethical and political concepts that depend upon visibility, comprehension, understanding for their vitality? So for example, how do we think about the ethical demand if we start from the premise that we cannot understand the other and we cannot therefore understand the demand of the other? Or frankly, I cannot know myself and I cannot know my own desires. Where do we go from there ethically? Politically, if we believe that we want to go beyond an idea of subjectivity or sovereignty that would be grounded in an identity, what do we do then? So what I would say about anarchaeologies is that it makes an argument for a return to deconstructive reading. It makes an argument for reading as a practice that would guard the errors, blind spots, and misunderstandings that I argue, following the work of Derrida and Demand, among others, comprise the most potent aspects of literary texts. It rejects the notion that attending to textuality, to literariness, constitutes a betrayal of ethics or politics, just as it denies the reductive idea advanced by some that literary texts would exhibit ethical or political import or meaning only through a readable, translatable, ideological message. So anarchaeological reading opens the way for a more elusive, opaque, yet not for that reason any less radical ethical political path. and archaeologies argues, finally, for the pursuit of an undeconstructible notion of justice that may not be recognizable as either ethical or political. So because we may not recognize something as having ethical or political import doesn't mean that it does not, but rather that it's not legible as such. And finally, I think that this book makes a disciplinary argument. So it emerges at a particular crossroads, historically, geopolitically, and disciplinarily. It is of and exceeds the early 21st century. It responds to contemporary ethical and political questions while making an argument that it is only by deconstructing history, by acknowledging the intempestive or untimely nature of the present, that we can attend to its most radical demands. It is of and exceeds Argentina. Argentine narrative, film, and art activism such as Borges, Piglia, Saer, and especially Aira, a bit of Albertina Carri, and the Internacional Errorista art activist movement comprise the book's central corpus, if only to make the case for an anti-identitarian, national, regional, or otherwise method of reading. It is of and exceeds Latin American studies. It proposes a Latin Americanism after deconstruction, or perhaps a deconstruction after Latin Americanism, one that engages with and pushes past the dominant disciplinary modes of allegory and representation, identity, and difference. It intervenes in and moves beyond antagonisms and deadlocks between deconstruction and Marxism, ethics versus politics, between a conservative humanism that would seek to revindicate the institutions of literature and literary studies, excuse me, on the one hand, and those who would seek to reject literary texts as a possible source of thought, ethical, political, or otherwise. And I think I'll stop there because my voice doesn't seem to want to go on. But I'd like to say that I agree with Gustavo that it was very unsettling to start a book in one kind of political context and end the book in quite a different landscape, so that I actually added an afterword later that talked about the politics of truth in the post-truth era in which we find ourselves. So I actually want to make a case that deconstructive reading and this particularly strange and kind of indirect relation to truth is actually even more crucial now when we find political leaders questioning not only scientific truth, but also the humanities as we might practice them. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Erin. All right, it's my turn. I have 5 minutes. Let me tell you a little bit about the book. And I figured, given the format, it would be useful to show you just a couple of slides. Let's see if that works. Let's brace yourselves. Aha, we have the slides. All right, so the book came out very recently, October 2019. The cover is by Alberto Araya, I'm happy to report. And the gist of the book is to provide a sublation of historical and new materialisms. And these are things that have been very hard to reconcile, that are often at odds. New materialists are supposed to be apolitical and care more about the environment, AKA trees, than about people, as if those things were at odds. And they're not, of course. And historical materialists sometimes are idealists, as it happens, because they don't look at stuff, at the world. They look at more ideas than they/we realize. And so what I want to do is to imbricate the new and the historical in narrative practice. I mean, this is a very literature-centered kind of endeavor. I coined this concept, which I hope will be fruitful, of transcultural materialism. It's a praxis, not a doctrine. And what it wants to do is to critique extractivism in the two senses of study something and also oppose it. It seeks to infuse the realm of externality with storytelling and literary language, some affinities with Erin there. Then it traverses nature and culture, hence the prefix trans. It's about a process, as in Ortiz's transculturación. It puts culture in scare quotes, or brings about also the etymological sense of culture in fermentation. And there's a quick definition there if you want to glance at it. But One thing that's important to note is that this is about Latin American intellectual genealogy. And I think that the chapters of the book does is to unearth that genealogy. I focus mostly on the region after 1989 because there is a seismic transformation in our rapport to non-humans. But I do Benjaminian flashes to moments of the past of Latin America after 1810 that are elucidating. The chapters have to do with such things as soil, corpses, luxury bags, personal computers, and all of their human entanglements as well. I'll just, show you a couple of slides with some of the texts that I discuss. They include, as it happens, Bolivar in La Carta de Jamaica, when he talks about indigo and cattle and so on. This is the kind of text that has always been read hagiographically and idealistically, but if you look at the actual stuff that Bolivar is talking about, other things emerge. Ditto for the contrapunteo, that we have just forgotten that it is about two plants, sugarcane, which has a shape, and also tobacco, which has leaves. And if you read the plants again into the contrapunteo, it's not like you abandon politics, it's just that you enter the realm of political ecology. And I think there's much to gain for both Marxism and new materialism. Also look at Echeverria, Da Cunha, a gem of a book that if folks haven't read it, I cannot recommend it in stronger terms, El Jardín de Nora by Blanca Viedjuter, a Bolivian. Glans, I have to do with Silva, of course, who was infatuated with things. Casablanca la Bella, Daniela Rosell, who has been dealt with, but not exactly in the terms that I'm looking at. I go back to Bolaño. I've written about Bolaño in context before. I continue to do that. I don't want to single him out overly. And I look at what he does with meat. For instance, when he brings about this Archimboldi, what's in a name, right? If you recall the character, representation of the human body in its fleshness, in its animality. This famous trompe-l'oeil. Chafek did not make it into the book, but I am owing Mariano Siskin and Guillermina de Ferraris an article that builds upon my findings on flies and meat. So I'm leaving Chafek there. And yes, just to quickly wrap this up, this allows you to see things like the Macondo oil rig spillover, the oil spillover off the coast of Louisiana, as part and parcel with 100 Years of Solitude, as part of the same eventuality of the eventfulness of literature. So it's not that I have become in love with the force of the signifier, oh, the well was called Macondo. It's that this event affects our reading of 100 Years of Solitude and vice versa. I can share this with anyone who'd like to, and happy to follow up one-on-one by email. Thanks.
A todo mundo, muchas gracias. Thank you so much, Karen, for organizing this. Can everybody hear me? I think it's working, right? Good. Thank you also, Amy, for taking this on. I see that we do have things in common. I was wondering, how is this going to be pulled together? But this is really helping me see what interesting books you guys have written, and I'm looking forward to reading more of it. It's very inspiring. I'm also really glad to have this conversation. These kind of events have been very rare for me personally in the past few years, and especially now under COVID, it's really a treat, even though we're on Zoom, and sometimes you do cut out a little bit out of my audio stream, but not too bad so far. So let me see. I also need to thank all those who made the research and writing of my book that I'm going to talk about here briefly possible, especially but not only the University of California Regents for a fellowship that allowed me to spend some time in Oaxaca, and to the media collective Ojo de Agua Comunicación in Oaxaca, who made a lot of their material available to me. All right, so I'm gonna see here. So my book, The Open Invitation, is an effort to think through the relationship between prefigurative politics and activist video, where activist video is not to be understood as a documentary register of the pro-filmic or of what happens in front of the lens, but rather as a collaborative practice and as a complex intervention into ongoing socio-political processes. As such, activist video interpolates viewers, inviting certain ideological and emotional responses, and it necessarily dialogues with a larger visual field, that is, with cinematic and televisual conventions and the expectations viewers bring to the process of making sense of audiovisual text. Considering the importance of Latin American revolutionary filmmaking and the emergence of new forms of revolutionary processes in the 1990s, most notably the establishment of the Zapatista Autonomous Territory, in revolutionary affect that activist videos makes apprehensible. I ask, can the joy that today's, excuse me, just a second. Cassandra, you absolutely need to let me concentrate here for a moment. Thank you. I have a 13-year-old. I'm doing what I can. Where am I? So an apparent shift in revolutionary affect that these videos make apprehensible, I ask, can the joy that today's activist videos transmit be explained politically? So I found thinking through the relations between video and social activism particularly interesting in the context of a 2006 uprising in southern Mexico, where a multifaceted social movement occupied the colonial city center of Oaxaca for 6 months before it was violently repressed. The Oaxaca commune became famous through the takeover of radio and television stations, massive internet postings and video recordings of performance protests, and because of its amazing graffiti with the videos that were made in this context. And I explore 3 key aspects. One, the configuration of the Oaxaca commune and its Asamblea Popular de los Pueblos de Oaxaca as a form of prefigurative politics, widely considered a nascent form of revolution. I argue that the APO, as it is known, did not pursue an instrumental struggle for state power, but it certainly signaled an open-ended process of experimenting with the enactment of horizontality, inspired not only by Marxism and anarchism, but also by feminism and most importantly by comunalidad, or communality. Comunalidad is a form of self-governance practice in Oaxaca's many autonomous municipalities that is similar in some ways to the experimental process of buen gobierno in the Zapatista autonomous territories. I maintain that indigenous organizations and their movements toward autonomy were indeed of key importance for the Oaxaca commune. And in that sense, at least, if not more important than, trying to think through this political moment using Rancière, some have done, and who I engage with at length in the book. So I argue that the comunalidad served as an inspiration for many participants that experimented with consensus governance in view of a future as such. And then secondly, or centrally, I study the participation of video activists in this movement of movements. Many video activists and filmmakers who either already lived in Oaxaca or traveled there were linked to the decades-old collaborative indigenous media movement. That movement itself constitutes a hemispheric network not limited to Mexico and has diverse and interesting connections with testimonial and revolutionary filmmaking in Latin America, as well as with the punk video and the Super 8 video movement that grew out of the Mexican student protests in 1968. In particular, I look at how Mal de Ojo Televisión, a former indigenous video center, came to function as an indie media center and producer of an extensive number of short and feature-length video documentaries. I argue that activist video practice must be understood not so much as part of a counter-public sphere that ultimately would make claims on the state, but rather as part of the Oaxaca commune's prefigurative politics inspired by indigenous movements for autonomy. So in the second half of the book, I grapple then with a conundrum, and I ask somehow, I think like this in the book: how can activist video, a genre committed to reflecting what occurs before the lens, make apprehensible a prefigurative politics? How can it make visible what has not yet arrived? So I discuss the limitations of activist video's tendency to engage in a politics of truth, where the activist recorded image serves as a proof of a pro-filmic reality more true than what is shown on television. Although the genre generally limits ambiguity and eschews poetic lines of flight and experimentation, I highlight several films that nevertheless include interesting but brief moments that subvert or suspend this evidentiary realism. I argue, however, that activist videos resonate most effectively with the APO's prefigurative politics through their optimistic affect. I develop a reading that differentiates between the melodramatic mode, which seeks to right a wrong, and an open-ended, joyful affect, a decolonial affect, I call it, that can be understood somewhat in Masumi's terms as pure potential. I argue that the uplifting scores and endings in many activist documentaries invite viewers to joyfully share in an ongoing process of experimenting with new social and political forms, despite momentary setbacks and even bloody repression. So the last chapter extends this view and draws comparison to the use of humor in collaborative and community videos in indigenous languages. But I think I want to just end by saying, because a lot of you mentioned that you felt your book was written in a moment of effervescence and optimism, and now we're faced with this kind of these terrible situations that COVID has just made even worse. That in this perspective, these would only be momentary moments, and that invariably this will also be turned around again, and there will be another moment of experimentation and ongoing and optimism and that coming out. So I don't think we are ever done, really. So again, thank you very much, and thank you for all of you who are attending this event, and I look forward to our conversation and questions, comments.
Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to offer a few questions now, and following on these summaries, I also want to acknowledge that I don't think I properly thanked Karen for asking me if I would consider moderating this, and so I really appreciate the invitation to read all these books. I would add that I think with moderators and the exercise of moderation, that it actually should be in moderation. So my questions are going to be brief, and they're also going to be in the service of trying to think the books together. So I wanted to say that the obvious strategy for reading these might be to subgroup the books together. And this really speaks to Freya mentioning that she wasn't sure of their connections. So one could think of Karen's and Héctor's books as perhaps being in conversation. One could think about the compatibility and incompatibility of putting them together, or one could turn to Gustavo and Freya's books and put them together to think the question of the performance of actuality and documentary aesthetics and activism in Brazil and Mexico. And in either of these reading scenarios, from there we could expand the conversation to include all the texts. But I really would prefer to open an interdisciplinary feedback loop to expose Rancière by way of Erin's sustained defense of deconstruction in her book. And that would involve focusing on keywords in each of the texts that in turn might serve to bridge the works. In an ideal world, all subsequent responses to my comments would be speculative, meaning that all the participants on the roundtable might agree to participate in reading as misreading. So I'm really interested in trying to bring some concepts from the books together and saying what would happen if Karen took this keyword, right, that actually Erin had brought up for us. So I want to start by saying the casual reader first encountering Karen's text might immediately pose the question, what is dematerialization? And Karen did a good job in her introduction of laying out some of what she means by that term in the long history of conversations about it. But I just want to remind that following Oscar Masota, Karen, throughout her monograph, writes against, around, through the false opposition of materialism and dematerialization. For example, noting in her focus chapter on Masota's praxis, quote, the artwork's physical supports become the simultaneously contingent and overdetermined moment where structure takes form in Masota's interpretations. For Masota, the work's materiality is neither opposed nor subordinated to language. Rather, the work's physical supports, whether in the thick paint of impastos or the electromagnetic waves of televisual transmission, stand as the logical site where history produces the forms through which it becomes legible. In this sense, I will argue that Masota's writings on art elaborate a materialism of dematerialization, end quote. Could we talk more about this both and as it pertains to the particulars of periodization operative not only in Karen's book, but across today's selections? And then Karen, you also take us on a journey from Argentina to Mexico to Chile, as you described. Could you speak more about the Latin American genealogy you propose of dematerialization rather than, or perhaps in concert with, conceptualisms that manage to incorporate, and your argument manages to, and I'm interested in this because your argument managed to incorporate it even Octavio Paz, albeit as the vanishing mediator of Marcel Duchamp. Okay, when I cited genealogy, when I was speaking of Karen's work, we might replace the word genealogy with archive. Gustavo did a really good job of laying out for us in his description of his book the centrality of the question of the word archive to his book's organization. In the introduction, for instance, he engages theories of the archive and writes of his book's generic focus, meaning his focus on documentary, quote, "The archive is also a useful concept for thinking about documentary filmmaking as a cultural practice that produces lasting records of the historic present, repurposes archival materials, and has a deeply rooted relationship with the idea of the document, the principal concern of the archive, and a term laden with authoritative connotations of proof, record, and evidence," end quote. Just as we've all probably asked our students and ourselves, I wonder if all of you could reflect further on the choices you made when constructing your project's archives. And Gustavo, could you speak a little bit more about the shift you name in Brazilian documentary filmmaking as it relates to the very idea of archivization, a thread which follows throughout your project, but in a very specific way? I'm interested in the ways in which conversations about that, generally about documentary, but more specifically in the Brazilian context that you lay out, might help us to think not only the question of truth claims right now, but also the way that there's such a prevalent conversation about fake news, et cetera, which in some ways I keep thinking about the relationship of these conversations about fakeness to certain kinds of innovations in the documentary form in the last 30 to 40 years. And I'm interested in thinking about what Brazilian documentary might have to say to us about mediating this relationship between truth claims and the fake right now. Okay, Erin, before I read how you linked the book and archaeologies to your prior writing on the figuration of the Marrano, and in effect suturing the anarchaeological and Marrano as critical modes of thinking to one another, I did not see the prefix "an" separated from archaeology, but rather the performative and constitutive utterance of anarchy in your book's title. Imagine my disappointment when I realized that the word anarchy isn't even included in your index. Can we talk about this? I'm asking everyone in the group if we can talk about this. Granted, returning to the archive, there's a moment of anarchic inheritance in your text when you direct our attention to Albertina Cari's not quite documentary and not quite fiction films, including Los Rubios. Returning there and elsewhere, I wonder about the connections between the anarchy of, and I can bear, because I see anarchy in this word, it always becomes difficult for me to say your title, anarchaeologies and the indisciplined of indisciplinarity, perhaps along the lines of Paul Feyerabend's Against Method, outline of an anarchistic theory of knowledge. And note, this might also be a question for everybody, all of the panel participants. Okay, I'm also, I really loved, Erin, your discussion of, in your introduction, of the way that no book is autonomous. I wonder if perhaps in your answer to one of these questions that I'm laying out, you could talk a little bit more about the links between this book and some of your prior positions on the Marrano deconstruction, Latin Americanism. I particularly love to hear you talk more about those terms and explain to me why they're not identitarian. Okay, speaking of autonomy, but also potential solidarities, Freya, thank you for the open invitation to consider questions like, can the joy that today's activist videos transmit be explained politically? How, if at all, can the political be apprehended through activist video? If activist video is the medium, and I'm taking these questions from your text, by the way, if as you know, but maybe other people wouldn't, if activist video is the medium committed to reflecting what occurs before the lens, how can it make apprehensible what has not yet arrived? If consensus governance arises from a disorderly whispering, I wish maybe all of us would unmute ourselves and engage in some disorderly whispering about now. What changes when we understand governance not as a noun but a verb? How open is the open invitation to join in these processes? Through errorism, utopian plagiarism, might some of these questions be applicable to other roundtable participants' archives? And yet, Freya, you are also clear about the guarding of thresholds, noting of the activist video Caracoles, that this is an open invitation, but it is not unlimited. Could you speak more about this? Could you link it to your book's open endings, focus on humor? And finally, when I first opened Things with a History and read its epigraph, I laughed aloud. And then I wanted to tell everyone the epigraph, like knock, knock, call up my friends and tell them the joke. More recently, last night, describing to my partner and son, 13, 14-year-olds are very useful, by the way. I was struck, my son that is, but I was struck by the reaction to its title, ¿Qué hay de material en la cultura? Both thought that the question sounded like someone asking after the mystery ingredients in a soup. The reaction returned me to Héctor's introductory remarks on historical and new materialism, his delineation of his key phrase, transcultural materialism by way of food. Here's the loop. What is the relationship, if any, between transcultural materialism and dematerialization in the context of our roundtable discussion? Feel free to also consider addressing materiality and material labor, et cetera, And since we've arrived here, and Héctor adroitly navigates the relationality of world literaturism and Latin Americanism, you're all also welcome to discuss or refuse site specificities. Finally, on a related note, a question would be yet another for the team. Héctor, I appreciate your discussion of the prefix trans and the suffix eon, but what about isms? I would love to hear you discuss the merits of regenerating a material ism by way of transcultural materialism. Okay, that's it.
Should we go in order? Or that was quite an intervention, Amy. That was like an intervention in and of itself, a work unto itself. That was really amazing, and like the hardest questions imaginable. So to be perfectly honest about the materialism of dematerialization, a lot of this, I had a friend at Cornell who used to refer to the classes we took as the like Althusser Badiou, Lacan Hall of Mirrors. So some of the issue of dematerialization, and I think then this speaks directly to Héctor's maybe points of departure. In a sense, it had some enemies, and some of those were the rise of the discussion of new materialism, the way they seem to be seeping in as if naturally to discussions of conceptual art or immaterial art or dematerialization, and that often or in relation to immediate processes or technical processes of production, in ways that were frustrating to me because they were in a sense so immediate and they were so arrogant, so convinced that these things were related, right? And so in part the materialism of dematerialization is has to do with this question that was like ever present, in the formalism of sort of thinkers influenced by structuralism in the 60s, in the sense that, everyone was looking for the form of form, the concept of concept, the theory of the theory historical materialism, right? The concept of radical historical change. And so part of the, as I kind of mentioned in my little spiel today, part of what was at stake was trying to show the extent to which there was a kind of reflexivity going on, but not necessarily at the level of an elaborated concept, and that it was going on in all of these works. And also that sort of at the level of what can be seen, or the heuristic level, the kind of disappearance of the work of art had something to do with this. In other words, it's when it kind of, and I think one of the, Roberto Jacobi phrases in the manifesto for the media at Grupo Arte de los Medios is that, the work of art disappears in the moment of its realization, right? So what did this kind of disappearing of the work of art allow us to see about the sublime object of ideology, right? And so that's how I try to sort of winnowing down these sort of discussions in these kind of epistemologically inflected discussions in structuralism and structuralist Marxism, sort of how was I going to address or take on what I found frustrating or limiting in Althusser's approach in particular, and then in sort of like related discussions, that come up in his students about what is the, what wager does art or politics have on truth. In regards to the conceptualism, part of the choice of words was that it allowed me to say dematerialization rather than conceptual art, was that it allowed for art to kind of address a problem that the word conceptual art or conceptualism had excluded. Lots of nominalist discussions in the 90s and early 2000s about what is or isn't conceptualism, highly historicist in the way that they include or exclude certain works or artists because, the artist did or didn't use the word themselves. I just wanted a way of kind of getting around those discussions and at the same time addressing them, saying what was their insufficiency, what was the kind of historicism or culturalism that they assumed, and how is there was a more complex, a bigger, more complex, and at the same time very localized, very, in Masota, very vernacular kind of thinking, right? A kind of big thinking rooted in an extremely vernacular language oftentimes that wasn't aware of the kind of theory of its own kind of meta concept. How is it that how we could find it in these works instead of having to kind of just apply some sort of ready-made framework about conceptual art or immaterial labor to this material that we had at hand, right? And so that was sort of why I had taken up why I sort of preferred or tried to make more complex the word dematerialization. Also to like structure a book that actually has its roots in a Latin American thinker. Imagine looking at Latin American art and expanding upon speculatively what one of its kind of most interesting thinkers had to say about it at the time. Not as a work of kind of reconstruction of an archive, but rather as a kind of speculative exercise. It takes as its point of departure a thinking that's really rooted in a conjuncture. And it's true that Octavio Paz is a kind of matching mediator for Duchamp, but he also has a specific role to play. In other words, that sort of, the way that he addresses Duchamp, the way that he deals with Duchamp is radically different. I know everyone hates like talking about Octavio Paz and, having to read about Octavio Paz, and so did I. But at the same time, it's very rich thought in the context when you put it next to, say, Joseph Kossuth, right? When you put it next to the recuperation or the kind of imputation of a genealogy or inheritance that's going on in US conceptualism at the same time. There's a hilarious book review that I mentioned in the book by Rosalind Krauss that she writes when the Octavio Paz book on Duchamp is published in English or translated into English, where she totally gets it wrong, which is like just a symbolic thinking, where she sort of isn't aware of his kind of theses on modernity. And so what's really at stake in the dematerialization of art is really what's at stake in his essayistic oeuvre more generally, which is this problem of the universal projection of the nation, right? The I that is we and the we that is I, the subject of this kind of national, of the nation state, for however problematic Octavio Paz's dualistic thinking and liberal Catholicism is. And yeah, the choice of the archive was a little bit, there's no real genealogy and it's really a work of thought. So the idea isn't that only these thinkers or only these works had something to say about dematerialization, it's that from them we have interesting ways of expanding the concept, not just to kind of fit more things in it, but also to sort of expand it conceptually, to treat it conceptually. Not every work about Latin American art or art criticism or culture has to be only the composition of an archive. Latin American thinkers also think, and so we can also treat it in that way, but in relation to their conjuncture as an intervention into the sort of broader field of art theory and art criticism since the 1960s.
We don't have to go in order, but I can go next these are really good questions and really tough questions. I think that the issue of the status of truth, right, in our contemporary political environment, and something that Erin brought up, and that kind of, forced another chapter or invited another chapter in Erin's book, could also do the same for mine some extent, right? Because the status of the documentary kind of comes into question in a new light in view of the erosion of the possibility of truthful speech or of what is happening with political discourse. And I think the documentary is really interesting in this regard. And when I think of the documentary in my book, it's not the documentary, obviously, in the sort of television form, right? The documentary is a very, very, very ample, free, experimental form from its moment of birth, because it's the least expensive, it's the least important, it's the least industrialized, right? So it has on the one hand this affinity with positivistic discourse and with a sort of journalistic idea of truth, and on the other it has this deep kinship with experimental art, right? With ethnographic films, with so in the history with city symphonies, with montage, with etc. But in the case of Brazil, you have while you have 1960s, you have this very positivistic sort of sociological documentary moment. In the 1980s, you have very different things at play, like you have video art and how video artists merge into documentary. And then you have Eduardo Coutinho and his emergence of like a sort of a dialogic sort of filmmaking that doesn't posit anything anterior to itself, right? The thing that the film is emerges at the moment of the film, etc. And in the discourse about film in this period, 70s, 80s, right, we have a very vigorous attack on the positive value of filmic images, right? Whether it's from screen theory or from post-colonial theory and the critique of ethnographic images. So this is really the sort of undermining of the truth value of the image was the bread and butter of film criticism and of some veins of film practice for at least the better part of 3 decades. So it's interesting to see how the documentary deals with that. And I think it has always dealt with that. I think good documentary film is very skeptic of what it's doing, right? I think what Erin said about defending or recovering an idea of deconstruction that is actually has a very, very positive political value for the present, suppose, right? So I think the documentary's critique of itself, or critique of the possibility of truth, is essential for what is lacking, right? For it's kind of an antidote. It's not like, oh, in a sense, like our dismissal of science, in a sense, or the ways in which humanities has critically thought of science comes under some new strain when science is displaced now by political, the extreme right, etc. Right? But it's like that's not the way. Like, this is not the way to think about this, because those critiques were qualitatively different, right? So I think that the documentary has been negotiating that relationship all along, collectively, right? Individual producers and contexts do it differently, and the archive, in a sense, the sort of I think it's in the DNA of the documentary to deal with the issue of the archive. It has that burden, in a sense. The documentary is never the archive, right? It is kind of in the book, I kind of argued that it's something it functions on the threshold of the archive, because it's always undoing it at the same instant that it's producing it, right? So it's a moment when, in a sense, the archive spatializes time and gives it some sort of fixed, it kind of arrests it, right? When I think that what cinema does is it plays precisely at that border of temporalizing space and spatializing time, right? And I think it is that hinge point that is interesting. And the best, and I'll defend the best filmmaking as important art for thinking about the present, are the films that are located precisely at that moment, right? When there is a certain indiscernibility, yes, but it is also the place from which to think about truth.
These are great questions and wonderful comments. Thank you, Amy. I want to respond to, I probably won't be able to respond to everything, but I do want to just echo a few things that were just said by Karen and Gustavo, because they're really important to me. The first is that I believe it's vital to think about the different Latin American artists that we are working on as themselves thinkers, producers of thought, producers of concepts, consciously or unconsciously. In other words, it's not so much that a writer or a documentary maker necessarily says, "Oh, I'm going to advance this theory or this concept," which they might, but it might be that through our reading of them, through our interpretation, we can imagine concepts that that revise or really unsettle some of the concepts that we find in ethical and political philosophy, so that we can think of artists as themselves kind of unorthodox ethical or political philosophers. And that's one of the arguments certainly that I'm trying to make. And it's also something that I think that's really important in thinking more broadly about indisciplinary exposure, which is how I kind of finish the book. In terms of the question of the archive and of anarchy, I mean, the index may not have captured it. I think that there are a few mentions of anarchy, not anarchism in that kind of more limited political sense, but anarchic thinking is certainly something that is quite important to me, and the anarchic heart of the archive, you know, kind of following Derrida, is something that is very interesting to me. So that I think all of our projects, in really different ways, we don't like displace an archive, we don't erase an archive, but we engage differently. We attend to the anarchic aspects of that archive, and we also engage anarchically with the archive. So that's something that's quite interesting to me. We can talk perhaps later more about the marrano, but in my last book, I was interested in the marrano not so much as yet another identity or yet another form of subjectivity, but as a figure that makes identity or makes kind of stable subjectivities impossible. But we can talk about that perhaps later. And finally, I just wanted to say that, you know, I talked about what sort of led to the book. I would say that when I got to the end of this project, I also had a similar sensation of really realizing the limits of the project. And that will, I think, lead to future project or projects. One had to do with really restricting most of the study to narrative. And so I'm quite interested in my next book in looking not just at different media, but at the relation between different media, which I'm calling transmedial exposure. And finally, I mean, I have to say that I got to the end of this book and I looked at the bibliography and I was pretty horrified that it was incredibly white and male. And I think I fooled myself into thinking that, oh, I engage with thinkers and writers kind of despite identities, and yet seen kind of as a totality, it really bothered me. So I would say that that's also something that's really motivating my current work and current projects. The Transmedial Exposure Project, in which I'm really hoping to engage with Black and feminist thought, but also a project that some of the people here are involved in on women in theory. That's it.
Freya, should you go, or do we want to maintain the alphabetical order?
It doesn't matter, Héctor. Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, great. Thank you, Amy, for those wonderful questions, really. And I'll provide 3 quick replies. I take it we're going until 2 p.m. Pacific time, so we want to leave time for everyone's questions. On the issue about the archive, well, I think that the archive in the book, vast as it is really the tip of the iceberg. And I was more interested in the how than in the what, you know, in the how, in crafting a way of reading, in crafting a method that is applicable. And I think that people are encouraged and, you know, welcome, of course, to just bring it to other domains. On the question about dematerialization versus materialism, it's a great question. And, you know, in a previous life, I studied medieval philosophy of language, Duns Scotus and Ockham and all that good stuff. And so if you look at the debate between nominalists and realists, it sounds a bit like some of the debates in some quarters in new materialisms, object-oriented ontologies, and so on. So what does that tell us? That, you know, plus ça change, plus ça reste pareil? Not the case. Rather, it has to do with your question about the isms, about the movements, the swirls, the inclinations of us collectively as critics. And, you know, there are times for dematerialization and there are times to go back to the object. And this is part of a tussle, you know, of the push and pull that a paradigm like world literature, and that's in connection to the other part of your question, sometimes likes to just gloss over, you know, like it's not a movement, a tendency, a current, but a new state of events. I take issue with that. And then, you know, finally, the other thing to remember is that words devaluate. And we have a huge responsibility in adding value or in devaluating. And so when the word materiality is used, it can very easily lose its edge, right? We can remain at the level of entelechies and discussions of principle rather than showing with the words themselves, with the objects, engaging with the thinkers as thinkers, with the textuality, you know, and doing something. So I'm careful, you know, because one of the most idealistic things out there is the metaphysics of presence, which can sound like what we're doing in this roundtable, but I think our sensibilities are very far away from that. So anyways, that's a quick response, and I wanted to share with you my notes because this is the responses right here.
I have a few airplanes flying at this point, so if you cannot understand me, then let me know and I will move inside. But I'm going to, I find this very interesting because the question kind of how we think, or what are the materials that have us think, you know, are those theoretical texts, are those, you know, white male thinkers like Erin was saying, sophisticated things, is it conceptual art, right? Is it something that already is manifesting through its form in a sense that a lot of thinking has gone in, right? And I've always been intrigued by how much more, I'm reticent to call them pop forms, but I guess they are pop forms in a sense. Much more popular culture forms may also have us think. So in the first book that I wrote on Indianizing film, right, I was trying to look at indigenous video, which is not experimental really in any formal way, as a way of trying to think about a bunch of different issues that came up in the academic discussions at the time. You know, so in a sense, how an audiovisual form that does not try to conceptually manifest what it is thinking still would allow us to think and think differently, right? And in this book, in The Open Invitation, something, I guess something similar happened, right? So this is addressing both of those questions, Amy, that have to do with how I understood Karen and you to be addressing the relation between materialization and dematerialization, but also with the archive. So what is it that we're choosing, right, to work on? And in my case, these activist videos, some of them are what is commonly known as riot porn, basically, right? So it's footage of protest and repression, right? And some of it is edited, and none of it really is experimental in an art sense. None of it is conceptual art. None of it is maybe what Gustavo would call good documentary, right? It's carefully thought out and well put together and really trying to push, you know, certain responses, and yet it does. Yet these videos do push certain responses and make an intervention in a particular way. And in that sense, so I'm intrigued, right, by this form that is not a representation a posteriori, right? It is not what you were saying earlier, Karen, right, where the artist moment comes when political representation stops, but it's at the same time, political representation is no longer claimed, it is enacted. We don't need the state to give us anything, says the social movement, we're just gonna do it, basically. And the videos participate in that very moment of action as an intervention, as another form of claiming subjectivity, political subjectivity, right? So that's kind of, I don't know. So the choice is made when constructing a project archive, right? Going to films that have truth claims at the very moment that all these truth claims are going through the window, even in video, right? We have all these, and now maybe even more so than in 2006, but already in 2006, there's all this digitally manipulated content, and how can you then say, no, what we're showing is true? But that is exactly what is happening. So then how do you think through that? What does that mean? What does that have you think at all, right? And I guess that connects to the question of the open but limited invitation. So in a sense, my book is also an invitation to read and to look at these forms that are not what would commonly appeal to us as critical academics and thinkers, right? But they are really appealing to undergraduate students and even graduate students. So when part of what motivated me to disembark on this project was that I teach a lot of new Latin American cinema, kind of the revolutionary aesthetics, experimental stuff, right? Filmic jolts and what Laura Podolsky calls the melodramatic modes of new Latin American cinema, right? The social realism, all that stuff, right? And they're all like so depressing, and students are either disengaged or depressed afterwards, and right? And once I started including at the end of the quarter some of these activist documentaries, they all like became uplifted and inspired, and they also wanted to make a difference in the world. And so I'm like, okay, again, what does this have us think, right? What's going on? How come these videos that are so simple in a lot of ways, what is their relation to a new kind of politics that is happening right now? And so then thinking does start happening, in a sense, through this archive, but it is a limited invitation in the sense that a lot of people are not going to want to watch this. And just like the social movement has a kind of an open-ended, and as I'm working on more, this connection of the human and the non-human, Héctor, I find, I really need to read at least the first part of your book carefully. It is what I didn't say in that book, but I'm thinking now, right? It is keeping the door open to including other actants, other forms of agency, other actants as actors, as political subjects, in a sense, in trying to figure out how to move forward in this world that is just so decrepit and ruined and depressing in a lot of ways, right? So it's an open but limited invitation to readers to engage with a material that is not of artistic value, let's say, right? An open but limited invitation on the part of the social movement to participate in a transformation. Opus Dei can't participate, they're not really welcome, and a lot of others on the extreme right wing aren't either, right? But what to do with the narcos is another question, it becomes more complex. What else? The anarchic, I don't know. So I guess the engagement with the anarchic in this sense is breaking the idea of canons, right? Of established kind of narratives, at the same time saying, if you're going to break with a canon, you got to know what the canon is, right? What is it that we're breaking? So even if you're trying to break a canon in an anarchic mode, then you're still, in a sense, recalling that in what you're trying to dismantle, right? And in this case, in the case of this book, the anarchic for me was more a kind of popular understanding of this being, radically anti-authoritarian and very horizontal, and all these like young folks that are linked to the punk movement, and more recently other forms of, just trying to enact something just like the, what was that called now again? The media, Now I'm blanking thanks to social isolation. I think the movement where we all had these speakers, right, where people were trying to dismantle the 1% against the 99%, and we were like, everybody was, now the new revolution is coming, right? So this kind of an anarchic form, finding a counterpart in comunalidad, in a form of social administration, self-administration that tries to channel that, but at the same time, you know, create some form of trying to create an interaction that is respectful at the same time, that lets people speak and finish and listen, right? Even if it might take a long time, and that keeps itself open. That can't be fixed in institutions, right? But is open toward the future, towards additional changes, additional challenges, always under evaluation, right? And so in that sense, going forward in an anarchic moment, right? I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my long answer. Thank you for the questions.
So Amy, I'll just give the panel back to you. I'd ask people in the chat to post questions that we could maybe discuss them for another about 20 minutes or so. So if anyone wants to do that, that would be wonderful, and Amy can moderate that discussion. So if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat and Amy will call you out.
Actually, people could also just, I mean, I don't know if there would be total chaos, but if people just want to unmute themselves and ask the questions, that could work too.
Sure. Maybe the first person could unmute spontaneously.
I think there's also like a hand raising button, although I've never been able to totally find it, or people could put it in the chat, or they could just speak something.
I'll jump in. If you need to raise your hand, if you open the participant tabs, you can raise your hand in there. That's the way you do it. So, you know, I read some of the books, not all of them, but thank you. I mean, to have so much talent of our field in the panel is very encouraging these days. And with that spirit, I have perceived in the different projects of your books an implicit or an explicit challenge to the ideas of Latin Americanism that under which we were educated. We come from different moments of the field, but you know, Erin and I come from a similar moment, and we both remember what was NYU Spanish at the time, or Pittsburgh Hispanic Studies at the time, where there was a very significant stake about certain ideas about the specificity of Latin Americanism, a field that really built in dialogues within itself, and the importance of sort of breaking away from Eurocentrism and talk about the specifically or the concretely Latin American. And what I read in your books in different ways is either, especially in the case of Karen, Héctor, and Erin, but I think it certainly expands to Gustavo and Freya in different ways, is an attempt to desterritorializar that old geography of Latin Americanism that was so central to our own formation, and really try to create assemblages both on different geographies regarding how the cultural production of Latin America circulates, and also different conceptual assemblages that seem to depart in many cases. And I think Erin's book is particularly an example of this. Break away sort of from the theorization of a specificity that was behind the ideas of transculturation, heterogeneity, and some of the things that we learn in our own graduate formation. So I was wondering, on that note, if you could reflect on how do you understand your books to be located in a larger map of our field? Like, what are not so much the conceptual or the critical stakes of your projects within themselves, but rather what is the wager towards a future of our discipline? You can say if it, at the moment of conceptualization of the book, or even if you have revised your thinking considering the slow catastrophe that we're living. So.
I'll start if no one else wants to jump in. Thank you so much, Nacho. I mean, Nacho is you're someone who has always had such a kind of panoramic view, not only of Mexican studies, not only of Latin American studies, but really of kind of global literary studies. And I really appreciate the question coming from you, especially. I always like to say that you were my student, but that's actually not the case. Nacho was in his last year as a PhD student when I was in my first year as assistant professor. So, you know, but of course he was always way beyond the rest of us. No, I think that you're right. And I think that one of the ways in which I'm interested in challenging Latin Americanism and Latin Americanism's break from or kind of reaction to Eurocentrism is not to enact a return to Eurocentrism, but rather to, first of all, show that those relations were always at the heart of Latin American thought. In other words, I'm against the idea that there's a kind of pure or purist Latin American thought. We see that tendencies, I think, in certain areas of Latin American studies. So I'm against that idea, but that doesn't mean going back to kind of a geopolitical hierarchy in which kind of the metropolitan centers can theorize the objects of theory, whether it's North, South, Europe, Latin America, et cetera. Which is why I think it's important that a number of us did mention the idea that the producers of these art objects are themselves theorists. So just by kind of shaking up that hierarchy, I think that we can revisit some of the taboos of Latin Americanism past, not in order to reify the hierarchies and inequalities, but really to think differently about the relationship between kind of theory and objective theory, but also kind of all of the implications geopolitically. I'll leave it there, but I am very interested in thinking about new approaches to Latin Americanism. And I think someone mentioned, oh yeah, Héctor, you mentioned Mariano and Guillermina's very ambitious project that they're launching right now. My contribution to that project is proposing something that I'm calling distorting Latin Americanism. So we can talk about that.
I might just quickly add to Ignacio's excellent question. I think that this was one of the questions that I had in mind that comes up a bit in the introduction, which has to do with, I think, one of the ways that I found myself coding the project was about the 60s. It's about culture and politics in the 60s, right? And a number of books have been published in that vein. In the years since I started researching this and since it's in its publication. And one of the frustrating things is a problem that really structuralist Marxism, one of its greatest merits was to address, which is that you can't suppose that society like Mexico in the 60s, Argentina in the 60s, pre-exists these phenomena, right? And so one of the aims of the books was, in other words, you don't want to create X society and to kind of ontologize the society. You get a lot of ontologies. You get books kind of talking about cultural phenomena as if they were ontologies of a specific country. And so in addition to not really being faithful to one national context, but yes, to the kind of institutional and socio-historic determinants of different discourses and projects, one of the things that was an issue is really, it sounds ridiculous to say the structuration of society, but what really was at stake was the extent to which, this question of what to do with art or what is a social function of this art now that we're out of modernism and realism, was really to allow us to see this, like the actual organization of social relations, right? To see the role that ideology or myth, or however you want to kind of name it, plays in it. So so in relation to the field, I think that it's an intervention that is interested in questioning both the kind of national circumscription of studies, but also I think more importantly, the how we understand the social and sociocultural studies, right?
I'll say something very briefly. Nacho, thanks for the question. I think it's great to bring to our discussion the kinds of questions that other folks have been asking about, yes, deterritorializing, re-territorializing, also even provincializing. There's Chakraborty's, very influential for the subaltern studies movement, but that idea of provincializing Latin America hasn't really been taken up. We were so content with the notion of literatura regional, novela de la tierra, even, in the Carlos Alonso, kind of like reading that against the grain. There's plenty of room to do interventions in how we see the field. And the question then is, what could be a guiding principle? And at least for me, I'm interested in interventions that would be beneficial to the works that we study and that, in a sense, we work for. They don't work for us, we work for them. We shouldn't replicate in our practice extractivism. The extractivist way of doing scholarship is, I bring you this great work of art without engaging with it and build off a career, and that's, end of story. So this is a facetious and it's a caricature, but we also have to be mindful of ways in which our interventions, again, add or subtract value, or can be part of a gift economy, right? So that's just a quick reaction, Magic. Thanks.
Can I add something real briefly too? Just for me, the process of writing only works if I think as a kind of montage. I think cinema kind of influences the way I can actually produce any kind of writing. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And I think that even though I'm not sure if that really gets to Nacho's to the key question in a historical sense, but like for me, it was really important to think about what is the geography of Brazilian film in a way that we actually perceive it, and then to reshape that geography. So like even the idea of like taking different regions and shifting the order and priority of the text and seeing what happens when you do that. It's a very kind of film-like form. And I think the best parts of my book result from those experiments that are a little bit like formal experimentations. What happens if you take an indigenous film that's pretty much corralled into some sort of like indigenous activism realm, and you think of it as a theoretical text that allows you to think about the idea of the archive proposed by either Derrida or Levi-Strauss in a different sense, right? By both changing the locations, but also inverting the specific orders. What if they the text that is close read is the Derridian text in light of a minor film, right? So I think I don't think this is anything new for anybody, but it's like a very pragmatic process for me, is to keep on trying to do those flips, because I think it's in that friction that something interesting that convinces me that I feel like I can write this comes up. And I think also it reshapes the organization of what we can see, right? So I think that flipping the presumption of what kinds of texts, which texts speak in what way, right? They have the text that produce this knowledge or this kind of knowledge, and flipping that, but also reshaping that geography, right? And then for me too, it was like, what happens if you take Brazilian film? And that's the case when I teach anything Latin American. If you don't take it as a marginal, we all do this as a marginal example to the university. We do this. This is like the first thing we learn to do, right? And we're never done doing that, right? Of reshaping the way in which things are main text and footnotes, right? So what does the Brazilian documentary say about documentary in general that documentary has not thought, right? I don't think I was fully satisfied with everything that I read, but that was like, to me, that would be the ultimate thing. The ultimate proof of value, I think, of it would be if the universal became legible in an entirely different way, because the marginal explain it to itself, right?
So I totally agree with your approach there, Gustavo. I think that is, so in the open invitation, for instance, I look at how Rancière conceptualizes the political, and then I try to read what you now called minor forms, right? So these activist videos as a different form of thinking about the political. So what do we learn when that happens, right? What do we learn about the importance of history or not, and notions such as consensus, right, as the limit of the political in Rancière, right? But it is the moment of potential, right, and of actuality in through the activist videos. And then how can we come to grapple with that, right? And then that does something, of course, to what you're asking, Ignacio, I think, for Nacho, so you know, we have people here on the panel that are working on literature, on philosophy, on documentary film, on activist film, right, on conceptual art, right? So all these are not, very few of these are part of the traditional, okay, here's the canon of literature, or here's the canon of film, right? And at least from my perspective, I think my whole academic life, so what, 20 some years or something of working on stuff, has always been pushing against these ideas. Okay, you know, if you work on indigenous, then you must be an anthropologist. If you do anything, and if you say indigenous, you're an anthropologist. So certain disciplinary expectations are being brought from the side of anthropology. And if you say, no, I'm not an anthropologist, I'm actually a cultural studies person, and I was educated as a literary scholar. And I think that, you know, activist video has something to say to the field of literature. Then you're crossing all kinds of different forms, and you're arguing for something. I think it becomes really big. You know, how can you, I mean, even you who have like such an amazing talent and ability to grasp these like big contexts and these amazing, you know, archives and details of all these different things, how can you think of bringing together interventions from different forms of representation, if we want to call them forms of representation, right? So video, film, art, installations, performance, literature, different kinds of literature, right? Hybrid forms of interventions, if you include all the stuff that's going on with and on the internet now. I don't know, right? I don't know, but in any case, the nature of academic work always in the end does tunnel us back, right? I was thinking as well, so you're talking about the field, and I make that case in my department, where I am one of very few so-called Latin Americanists. My department is post-area studies. People work on all kinds of things, and we usually come together around issues or concepts, right? So decolonization might be one, right? US supremacy might be another, or white supremacy might be another in that context, right? So how do you think these kind of overarching political concepts in this case, in a field that is radically post-area studies and post form, if you want, form of representation. And at the same time, I tell them, no, I'm a Latin Americanist, right? That's really what I know something about. So it's an interesting question, and I don't know exactly how one could envision, you know, going forward, except for in a radically anarchist manner, you know, just like bring our stuff together and then let's think about things that we have in common, such as here, right? Where we have books about totally different things, yet they all talk about this relationship in one way or another of how we understand the political and what used to be called representation.
Thank you. I want to actually just say that there's two other people waiting in queue to ask a question, and Karen's noted to me that we should wrap this up in about 10 minutes. So I'm wondering, for the sake of expediency, if Mahmoud and Matthias might want to both unmute themselves and each take a turn posing a question or series of questions. Thanks.
Okay, I can go firstly, actually. Thank you so much for all of this fresh ideas about Latin America for someone who is still discovering everything about Latin America as a native Arabic speaker. And I have a question for Erin, actually, about the anarchic way of thinking, or anarchic approach of thinking. And if anarchism as a way of thinking could include a radical resistance dimension. So what it could have more than radical resistance, and what is the role of deconstruction in framing or articulating the idea of anarchism or anarchaeology? Thank you.
Actually, I didn't have a question. I was just testing what Nacho was saying, that you can raise your hand, but I actually have a question, and it's in the same line, Mahmoud, and actually it's for Erin and for Freya. That is first of all, I mean, I haven't read Erin's book, but I assume that it's connected, that anarchic sense is connected to Schurman, in the sense that the possibility of thinking without an origin, and that is actually thinking. And it's the connection between, I mean, that type of thinking is not related to what I'm trying to rephrase something that Freya said, that if you wanna destroy the canon, you need to know what that canon is. Actually, that type of thinking doesn't need that canon. That doesn't need that canon. But what I'm trying to say is that in that specific mode of thinking, and what you relate to thinking, that it needs to be anarchic in order to be thinking, is always critical in that sense. So something that is, in Mexico especially, there is a very deep sense of this kind of movements, especially on Zapatismo, the relationship between thinking and critical thinking. They're always trying to emphasize the fact of the necessity of critical thinking. In that sense, what I'm trying to ask is actually not what Nacho asked about a field, but actually about a discipline itself. How is this related for the task that we have? I think, I'm saying that in my words, but that the task that we have not only is the Latin Americanist field, but actually on the discipline of the humanities. And I'm thinking about discipline in two different senses. If we are able to read, as Erin says, do we need to rethink the discipline that actually trains that kind of reading? And in a large sense, thinking about the humanities, actually the humanities, the specificity that it has is that it actually teaches how to think and how to be able to have a proper meaning, an interpretation of what we have in front of us. In that sense, I mean, we know that there's only interpretations of things, but the thing we're talking about is that post-truth, which is very connected from my point of view to religion, is already a pre-interpretation of that text. You don't need a text in order to be a right-winger that already interpreted that text. So in that sense, I'm thinking about the discipline at large of the humanities, critical thinking, discipline at large, and the reconfiguration of the possibility of reconfiguration of how do we train that kind of, how do we open the door for that kind of reading that actually Erin is supporting. Okay, it was long, sorry.
Are there any other questions or comments before Freya and I respond? I also can imagine that Karen and Gustavo and Héctor would have really excellent responses to that.
Can I add one to Karen? Because you made a very suggestive comment when you were finishing your presentation about why go back to the 1960s today, and how the end of how you were writing, or you were returning to the 1960s as in a way against a certain critical gesture today about thinking about the end of class struggle and the end of experimentalism, and therefore the only critical path available was to just look back to document as a kind of as a dead history of sorts. And you said, if you want, I can talk more about this later, and I would like to hear more about this. Thank you.
Maybe Erin should go first, or although Erin's question, the answers are larger. But Erin, following the chronological order, Erin, you should talk first.
Sure. So first to Mahmoud, thanks so much for your question. I'm not so much thinking about resistance as part of anarchic thinking. In part, and maybe I'll link this with Matthias's question about disciplines and disciplinarity, for the same reason that I'm really interested in pushing the idea of indisciplinarity rather than the idea of actually interdisciplinarity, which I think is kind of a weak concept that doesn't really attend to the strengths of each discipline. Indisciplinarity for me, and indisciplinary exposure for me, allows the opening itself, the exposure of one discipline to another, to be critical, so that it's not so much that it no longer matters what our objects of study are, or it no longer matters what our methodological approaches are, but rather those objects and those methods are themselves subject to exposure, and therefore will always be shown to be limited and partial. So that when I, as a literary critic, expose myself to, let's say, as a Latin American literary critic, expose myself to contemporary Black thought, I'm going to see lack. I'm going to see weak points in my own field and my own methods, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to stop using them. In other words, it's going to allow me to continue to do this work, I think, in a different and more complicated way. But resistance to me, I guess, implies a certain kind of the possibility of exteriority, and I'm more interested, rather than kind of thinking of interiority and exteriority, I'm much more interested in thinking about, for example, returning to the question of anarchy and archive, the anarchic quality of the archive rather than dissolving the archive. So the kind of points of impossibility or untranslatability in a given discipline rather than dissolving disciplines. And so in the same way, I wouldn't be interested in resisting kind of from the outside as if I'm kind of another autonomous power that would resist this autonomous power, but I would think of it differently. I think I'll leave it at there. I'm not sure that I answered either question.
I think they're really interesting questions too, and you know, I wonder, Erin, and so I guess this is the question that you probably get a lot, if whenever you claim a Derridian approach, right? Is can you go beyond then continuing to use the methods that you now have become aware of and that we are now conscious of, and if we like, you know, basically, I think what you're proposing is an under erasure, right? So the Derridian idea of you do a strike through and then you can continue to operate, or you must continue to operate with whatever tool you have at hand, because that is the tool that has been historically created. But now you understand that it is a, you know, it has a history in a sense, and it has its limitations, and it has its discursive and practical framework within and from which it has grown, right? So I've been, I guess, you know, thinking also about what Matthias was saying about how do we train students, right? What is it that we're teaching them in the end? And so I look at some of my colleagues that would insist along, you know, similar to a lot of the activists that I'm studying, the forms of activism that I'm studying, they are always in the process of creating. They are in the process of creating something new. They don't have a new sack of tools or whatever at their disposition, but it is always in a process of transformation, of rather radically changing whatever is going on, right? And of doing. And the other thing, so I'm wondering, right, in a way, as we train students, undergraduate students and graduate students, how can we train them to become more just thinkers and more just practitioners of academia and academics, right? And within this institutional, hierarchical, very unjust framework that we are all have working within and making a living off at the moment, thankfully, right? Having an income as opposed to so many others that don't have one during these months. So I'm also inspired. The Isabel Stenger recent book is a meditation on what the humanities can do to the scientist. So she talks about how no matter how much ecological or feminist or whatever critique of science you offer the student of sciences, they cannot hear it. They will take the class because they're required to take the class, but they cannot hear that they need to question the approach to objectivity that science brings, right? So she then talks about a method, right? A changing method where she has the scientists, the students themselves search the internet for different interpretations of the same thing, same object of study, same experiment that they're doing, right? The same conundrum. And so they engage on a process of discovery. And instead of hearing from somebody, oh, there's this bias in the sciences and there's a history of, constructing nature as other, these things, they all of a sudden discover using their methods of scientific inquiry, but now engaging in a pseudo-humanist critical thinking exercise, right? That this is not the only way to think. It is not the only way to think. And then that might actually bring a tidal wave, right? A true shakeup of what it is in their own relation to their own work, right? So then the question, I guess, remains, I don't assume that I can change the structure of the university. And I know that at the same time, right now, there's a lot of money to be had if you apply for a grant where you propose to collaborate with the sciences, like as a humanist, right? So then, but how do you, so what is our role as humanists and who are we training and how is that different for undergraduates and graduates, right? For undergraduates, to my mind, it's like you need to imagine a world otherwise. You need to imagine that it is possible to have a non-capitalistic, non-colonialist, non-racist, non-heteropatriarchal world in order to move toward making that. Because if you can't even imagine that it can be otherwise, then all you get is the same reading again and again of, oh yeah, capitalism is the winner and there's no other way to do it. So that is the push, right? But for graduate students, that might partially be true, but partially maybe not, right? Because the question is, what are they going to do now? That, again, there are no more jobs. Who are we training? And what is it, what kind of a thinking and what kind of a doing and making are we pushing? I see Héctor is like, I want to say something. He's like, ready.
Well, I wanted to excuse myself because I have another meeting at 2 p.m. California time. That's what I was, aching to say. But I second, Freya, what you were saying. I think we're approaching a tipping point of the illocutionary power of language, or as Gustavo would put it, undermining the truth value of the image. If slightly polemically, I think it's time to give deconstruction something of an anchor, but I mean that metaphorically. Thank you all. I'm sorry, I have to leave.
So since we've lost one of our roundtable participants, we may be fading fast. So I'm just going to be very brief and thank Mariano for his question. Very generous that it is. Part of what I had said, I always have, there's this line in Peter Osborne's book about conceptual art, like Anywhere Not at All, where he says I might be reversing the terms of what is the art history that art criticism should be, right? And of course, he has a whole battery of ways to respond to that, which is nothing less than reconceiving of art and of judgment, right? As they pass through temporality. I think less ambitiously, the question is whether the periodization of the present, starts in the 1960s or the 1970s, or as in Gustavo's book, in the 1980s and the post-dictatorship, right? I think there's a certain periodization, obviously, undergirding all of these books, especially ones that make a certain claim on some sort of form of representation that's specific to a socio-historic moment or problem that's specific to a socio-historic moment. but regardless of whether it's the 60s or the 80s, I think the question is how to sort of, it's a kind of question of, it's a question of method, it's kind of a critical approach, but sort of how to get around this idea that, class struggle is over and we're just documenting the past. In other words, the question that Osborne poses is particularly, it calls my attention in a sense because this is so prevalent in art history, right? In the kind of boundaries, the circumscription of what you can do, what you can say, what you're allowed to say, not only about Latin American art, though it's particularly pronounced in that when you, as Gustavo was saying, when you get to, the margins of empire, that's always just a kind of example of a universal problem or a universal form. But it really is a kind of stricture in the field as a whole, right? You can only do critical work if you impute the critical work to some earlier thinker that you're now just documenting. So that's at the very basic kind of seed of what I was saying. But I think that the point of it, regardless of whether the periodization starts in the 60s, where I tend to see the sort of beginning of the present moment, is sort of how the work that you're doing can sort of do this work of beginning again, right? Kind of breaking open the assumption that this problem has been resolved, right? I try to do this through the notion of dematerialization, right? In other words, a concept that emerges, and the operation of how it's mounted, like how this concept, right, emerges from within a certain conjuncture, is universalizable but remains tethered to it. That's a kind of semi-Althuserian version or response to that. But I think that there are obviously many different responses. So we're ending this panel somewhat inarticulately of a kind of crawl to the kind of, critical creativity. That's what's at stake in that sort of, for me, in returning to the 1960s is something other than a kind of documentation of what was in the past. I think that you can say this in terms of the thinkers themselves didn't see it that way at the moment. They saw in the problems, in the contradictions, in social contradiction, a kind of the impulse for a new conceptual creativity. And it's sort of in that spirit and also in the way that you go about writing the book that I think we can try to bring that out. I'll turn it back over to Amy.
Are there additional questions? I'm thinking we need to wrap up. What do other people think? Yes, this has been awesome. Thank you to everyone on the panel. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, now we can all unmute and be anarchic and shout and yell at the same time.
And speak at the same, whisper at the same time.
Thank you, Amy and Karen. Yeah. Thanks to everyone for coming and wonderful questions.
Thank you so much. This has been really great, and I actually didn't get as tired as I often get on Zoom. Very stimulating. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Amy. Thanks everyone for attending and for all of you for agreeing to do this panel sort of as it was unleashed and tethered from its institutional strictures.
All right, take care and be well, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.